Sorry for the abrupt ending there, got cut off. Um, anyway, Dewey pioneered experiential student-centered learning aimed at integrating education with public life and developing the free and equitable intercourse, hence the shared interests essential for communal life. Can classrooms be democratic? Continued. It's a treaty business to organize an untraditional class in a traditional school. How, Paul Lynch asks, can a teacher who embraces critical pedagogy raise questions about authority without imposing authority in order to raise those very questions? And that's kind of what I was getting at before, is if the teacher is an authority figure, how can they reasonably ask them to question authority and not have a complete breakdown in the classroom? Dialogue is a directed means towards the end. And here's another good quote. I have to be radically democratic and responsible and directive, not directive of the students, but directive of the process. Freire. The need for authority. There has to be some authority because you don't want complete chaos in your classroom. Transformation depends on different, unequal voices interacting in the primary source of that authoritative voice. Shore suggests that that voice should be the more analytical, more politically committed teacher. Without authority, it is very difficult for the liberties of the students to be shaped. Freedom needs authority to become free. It may sound paradoxical, but according to him, it isn't. Democracy is a tricky business, Ira Shore. Giroux describes a classroom in which all voices and their differences become unified both in their efforts to identify and recall moments of human suffering and in their attempts to overcome the conditions that perpetuate such suffering. Elizabeth Ellsworth stated, as long as the literature on critical pedagogy fails to come to grips with issues of trust, risk, and the operations of fear and desire around such issues of identity and politics in the classroom, their rationalistic tools will continue to fail to loosen deep-seated, self-interested investments in unjust relations. So Giroux describes a very ideal situation in the classroom, and Ellsworth brings up the very valid points as far as how to be realistic. The means of producing student activities. Maxine Hairston stated dogma before diversity, politics before craft. And that was actually a criticism that she had. Kelly Ritter suggests that the internet allows students to read and write without teachers, and they're already doing these things independently. Victor Villanueva shares Freire's revolutionary goals. He finds their strategy of making the classroom a political arena precisely the wrong means of the end, and he's the one that had that nice anecdote about the very good black teacher named Floyd who unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your viewpoint, didn't succeed in radicalizing his students the way he wanted to. Freirean pedagogy in the United States. Who is to be liberated from what? This is a very complex issue because you need to identify who's oppressed and who's the oppressor and which students need liberation. How closely do critical teachers actually align themselves with the oppressed? If you're an educator, you have some degree of privilege. You definitely have education, and education is a privilege. So that in of itself, kind of like, if you're an authority figure, how can you question authority? If you're the oppressor, how can you talk about the oppressed? The same idea. Pedagogies of difference are fundamental to critical education. Differences are assigned and not fixed. This was an interesting portion. Rhetorical answers to student resistance. You need to employ rhetorical theory or smarter rhetorical strategies in order to defeat or combat student resistance. Karen Kopelson asks, how might we speak? As whom might we speak so that students listen? And she suggested that they need to be sneakier and cunning in the sense of the classical metis, maybe metis, willingly operates through reversal, deception, and disguise when necessary. And what she's referring to there is students may listen better or have a more open mind if the teacher doesn't have a obvious personal political motive. If the teacher presents themselves as a facilitator and arbitrator and not someone who has personal stakes, doesn't display any clear bias, the teacher may be actually more successful in bringing students around to their viewpoint, because once again, students will be more at ease. I thought that was kind of unethical. I agree that you shouldn't have an obvious political bias in the classroom, but not for that reason. But, I'm sure it gets the job done. Conclusion for Article 2. Human actions can move in several directions at once, that something can contain itself and also its opposite. Radical writing instructors walk one foot in the system, today's reality, and the other foot outside the system, the future utopia, with a playful smile. We see the world through the lens of symbols so natural, so unremarkable, that we often don't see how they persuade us to think and act in certain ways and not others. Article 3, pages 94 through 110, Cultural Studies and Composition by Diana George, Tim Lockridge, and John Trimber. The first question is, what is cultural studies anyway? But then the authors explain that really the question should be, whatever happened to cultural studies and composition anyway? The purpose of this article was to detail the history of cultural studies and their place in composition courses. What transformed how we approach cultural studies and composition? Rapid development of web technologies, gaming communities, and social networking, and a growing emphasis on public rhetoric, civic writing, and community publishing as legitimate areas of study and basis for classroom practice. Cultural studies, histories, definitions, and traditions. So, kind of ringleaders of cultural studies, Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, and E.P. Thompson began writing and sharing their beliefs in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They believed that cultural studies should be politically engaged and theoretically eclectic. But if you'll notice, Hoggart, Williams, and Thompson were all males, and white males at that. Feminism and anti-racism wasn't injected into the conversation until the 1970s and 1980s. They wanted to think, that would be Hoggart, Williams, and Thompson, wanted to think of culture as a way of life, a set of ordinary, everyday practices linked in creative and consequential fashion to the social order and the formation of class consciousness. Most of all, they wanted to recover the culture of the common people, to reclaim culture from its monopoly by anti-democratic and elitist forces both inside and outside the academy. Bringing cultural studies into composition. This was sped along by the democratization of higher education through land-grant universities, the GI Bill, and open admissions. I'm sure you all know somebody who is a veteran using veteran benefits. I'm someone who has, and I can't imagine that I would have ever been able to attend college without my veterans benefits. So I can definitely understand what they mean by that. Trimber viewed contemporary composition as emerging from part of a larger struggle to re-represent students and adult learners stigmatized and as uneducable because of cognitive deficiencies, the culture of poverty, or the restricted codes of oral structure, whereas Berlin focused on the role of cultural studies in the English department. The goal of rhetoric is to master the operation of signification in the distribution of power in order to become better writers and readers as citizens, workers, and critics of their cultures. And as I've already stated, a lot of criticism of early cultural studies pedagogy is that it was male and monocultural, dominated by the white male perspective. New media enters the mix. Two major cultural studies inquiries occurring within composition and media scholarship include the influence of social semiotic thought on the study of multimodality, the ethnographic turn toward amateur and vernacular texts published in digital spaces. Some interesting lines of inquiry regarding new media include: how do changing ratios of writing and images create textual meanings as the locus of literacy expands from page to screen? What I immediately thought of there was memes. You can pack a lot of thought and information into a meme with very, very little actual writing, and then you have an image, and it's amazing how much meaning you can derive from a meme. How do media fans disrupt traditional cultural hierarchies? How thoughtful and deliberate is their engagement with media? How has the growth of web technologies led to more personal and vernacular publications? How have these publications been used to further social justice issues and activism? The public turn. There has been a noticeable public turn in the cross-section between composition and cultural studies due to an increased interest in public rhetoric, community engagement, and the kinds of communication practices characteristic of public debate and action. These areas of investigation have resulted in historical and contemporary studies of the literacy practices of marginalized or previously ignored groups, the demand for and an emphasis on school-community partnerships and service learning projects connected to writing programs. That's what Article 1 was all about. The growing body of literature that engages with activist rhetorics and public sphere theory. Article 2 touched on that a bit. Criticism and solutions. Public sphere activity has traditionally been limited to the bourgeois, male, white, straight, and moneyed. This has led to the study of and acknowledgement of alternative or counter publics. This includes moving away from pure composition writing classes and towards those traditionally extracurricular studies, which is a little demeaning in of itself if someone considers the literature of your cultural background or gender extracurricular, whereas the canon is male and white. But particularly towards women's literature and African American literature, and we've seen this at JSU. You have to take a wide variety of literature courses, not just the traditional American and traditional English canon, which is good. We move towards a transnational perspective very, very slowly. This is possibly due to the institutional and conceptual separation of students marked as international, or English as a second language learner, the taken for granted status of English as the medium of teaching and learning, writing, and knowledge in the university, and the remnants of the colonial or imperialist mindset. But we did get there. Due to globalization, the multicultural diaspora, post-colonial theory, new notions of world Englishes, linguistic imperialism, and the hybridization of English. New notions of world Englishes is fascinating to me because English is spoken all over the planet, but it's not the same English. Even American English is distinguishable from British English or Australian English. The English spoken in the Indian subcontinent is very different. Reminds me of a part from Life of Pi by Jan Martel, where they say they speak a very funny kind of English in India. They like words like bamboozle. When's the last time you used the word bamboozle? It's an English word. It's not a very common one used here in America, though. Cultural studies and the composition classroom. 3 possible types of assignments outlined.